Table of contents. First period Apostolic Age, AD 30 to AD 80. There's more. Fifth period, the four canonical Gospels, AD 170 to AD 185. Chapter 38, Formation of the Roman Catholic Hierarchy, and review of sixth period, Testimony of Heathen Writers, general review and a conclusion. Here's a list of Christian writers and writings of the first 2 centuries, chronologically arranged from the book of Matthew to Paul, Gospel of Paul, to Prodicus, Menander, and Julius Africanus, second epistle of Clement of Rome. Note, the epistles of Paul, the author has taken as genuine, or these people involved have taken as genuine, the 10 epistles which constituted the Apostolicon of Marcion. The same course has been adopted by Dr. Davidson, except that he rejects, upon what appears insufficient grounds, the epistle to the Ephesians. First period, AD 30 to AD 80. The Apostolic Age, Chapter 1, Lost Gospels of the First Century. The Gospel of Paul, Gospel of Recollections of Peter, references and citations by the Fathers of the Church, views of modern writers, oracles on or sayings of Christ attributed to Matthew. These, the germs of the Synoptic Gospels, Luke, Mark and Matthew. This is an attempt to write a history of the Christian religion during the first 2 centuries. Not a history of Christianity, which would require us to follow the principles of that religion in their dissemination through various countries and in their influence upon other institutions, nor yet a history of the Church, which would make it necessary to examine the questions of ecclesiastical polity, to trace the rise and progress of different forms of church government, and to notice the manners and customs of the early Christians and their treatment by the civil magistrates. These are touched upon only in their bearing upon the main object of the inquiry, which is an examination into the principal doctrines distinctive of the Christian religion, so far as they were known and taught in the first 2 centuries. Also the principal books through which those doctrines were disseminated. The difficulty of the undertaking is great. The Gospels of the first century are unfortunately lost. Well, they're not actually, because the Apostolic Church of the East hid them from the Roman Emperor Constantine and his empirical state Roman Catholic Church and others for over 2,000 years, therefore preserving them intact, never tampered with, never translated, apparently possibly only in the Koine Greek, because the Koine Greek is very akin to that original ancient Galilean Aramaic, Tav Ashrit, etc. of the Old Testament and the New Testament Galilean Aramaic. There are left of that century only the epistles of Paul, the one epistle of Clement of Rome, some slight notices by Jewish and heathen writers, and a few legends and traditions preserved in the writings of the Fathers and in the extent 2nd century Gospels. And when we enter upon the next century, though there is more remaining than of the first, still the great body of the Christian literature of that age also has been lost or destroyed. This is what this author believes, because he doesn't know about this Apostolic Church of the East and them hiding, therefore preserving the original New Testament Galilean Aramaic manuscripts, scriptures, etc. Availing ourselves of what remains, we shall, though conscious of the magnitude of the task, enter upon it at least with fidelity to truth, in the hope that something may be contributed to the pages of reliable history. The time will be divided into 6 periods, to be designated as follows. First period, Apostolic Age, AD 30 to AD 80. Second period, Apostolic Fathers, 80 to 120. Third period, the 3 Apocryphal Gospels, 120 to 130. Fourth period, 40 years of Christian writers, 5th period, the 4 canonical Gospels. 6th period, close of the 2nd century, 185 to 200. Lost Gospels of the 1st century. When Christianity had become partially established by the teachings of Christ and the preaching of his apostles and disciples, there arose among the Christians of the various churches a necessity and hence a demand for some written testimonies or records of the life and doctrines of the great Master. But this need was not so apparent or pressing in the 1st century, and especially during the lifetime of those who had been with Jesus and had been his followers and companions. People need to understand that these disciples did not call themselves Christians. Far from it, because this word Christos, etc., was borrowed as a loan word. It was borrowed by the Romans from the Greeks, and perhaps written in the Latin as pointing to those who followed a particular person, the Christos, the Christ. So this Roman state empirical church, which was a pagan mix, referred to these people as Christians, when in latter apostles, etc., as Christians, when they actually went, because the disciples, being Galilean fishermen, speaking Galilean, would have used the word Mashiachai, meaning, in the Nearest English equivalent, the followers of the Mashiach, or the Mashiach, the Messiah, because Christos, etc., was a Greek word, not Galilean. Even though it had similarities in the English, the anointed one, anointed by God. When Christianity had become partially established by the teachings of Christ and the preaching of his apostles and disciples, there arose among the Christians of the various churches a necessity and hence a demand for some written testimonies or records of the life and doctrines of the great Master. But this need was not so apparent or pressing in the 1st century, and especially during the lifetime of those who had been with Jesus and had been his followers and companions. Of the numerous Gospels which were in circulation in the 2nd century, not more than 3 can, with any certainty or with any high degree of probability, be traced back to the time of the apostles. These are the Gospel of Paul, the Gospel recollections of Peter, and the oracles or sayings of Christ attributed to Matthew. The Gospel of Paul. Ewald, one of the best of the German critics, concludes that there was a Gospel of Paul, thinks it was in the Greek language and that it may have been written by the evangelist Philip. Here's a footnote indication there. And it suggested, look at Jar Bocker's book, his writings 1848 to 1849. It may be inferred that it afterward became incorporated into the Gospel of Marcion, AD 145, since Marcion was a follower of Paul and for his own Gospel claimed the sanction of that apostle. Here's a footnote indication right there. 2. C. Fabricius, Codex Apocryphicus, Hamburg 1708, Volume 1, page 372. Also, History of the Canon by Westcott, that'd be Westcott and Hort, 3rd edition, London 1870, page 282. Marcion was a native of Sinope, a town of Asia Minor on the south shore of the Black Sea. It is supposed that the church at Sinope was furnished by Paul at the time of its formation with a collection such as he supplied to the other Asiatic churches, containing records of the life and teachings of Christ. It was the opinion of Jerome and of several other writers that when Paul spoke of his gospel, Romans 2:16, 16:25, 2 Thessalonians 2:14, he referred to a written gospel then in circulation. Paul may have had such a gospel in mind, but his language is not sufficiently explicit to justify us in concluding with any certainty that he meant anything more than that gospel of good tidings of which he was the great expounder. There is, however, a more distinct trace of the gospel of Paul in his first epistle to the Corinthians, chapter 11, verses 23 to 25. By comparing this passage with Luke 22:19-20, it will be seen that the language is almost identical while the parallel passages Matthew 26 to 28 and Mark 14, 22 to 24 have no such complete similarity, though the idea is the same. The Gospel of Luke, whether directly or through Marcion, was founded partly upon the Gospel of Paul. That Paul had something to do with a written Gospel, which now appears in whole or in part, or in the compilation of Luke, is generally acknowledged. And this passage in 1 Corinthians, taken in connection with the corresponding passage in Luke, is strong evidence that in Corinthians Paul refers to a written Gospel which he had delivered to the church at Corinth, and a portion of which written Gospels appear in Luke 22, 19, 20. Paul may have referred also to the same Gospel in Galatians 2:2. This supposition receives countenance from a passage in Tertullian. In his work against Marcion, AD 207 to 210, after saying that Marcion did not ascribe his Gospel to any author, and arguing thence that it was not authentic, he proceeded as follows. Had Marcion even published his Gospel in the name of Paul himself, the single authority of the document, destitute of all support from preceding authorities, would not be a sufficient basis for our faith. There would still be wanting that Gospel which Paul found in existence, to which he yielded his belief, and with which he so earnestly wished his own to agree, and that he actually on that account went up to Jerusalem to know and consult the apostles, lest he should run or had been running in vain. In other words, that the faith which he had learned and the gospel which he was preaching might be in accordance with theirs. Then at last, having conferred with the authors and having agreed with them touching the rule of faith, they joined their hands in fellowship and divided their labours thenceforth in the office of preaching the gospel, so that they were to go to the Jews and Paul to the Jews and Gentiles. Inasmuch, therefore, as the enlighter of Luke himself desired the authority of his predecessors for both his own faith and preaching, how much more may I not require from Luke's gospel that which was necessary for the gospel of his master? Tertullian, I'm not too sure that word is ADC, Marcion, Book 4, Chapter 2, Ante-Nicene Christian Library, Collection 7, page 180. From this passage of Tertullian it is manifest first that there was a Gospel of Paul, and the inference is very strong that it was in writing, since Paul is represented as going to Jerusalem to compare his Gospel with another, and while there conferring with the authors of the other Gospel. Secondly, that it was necessary for the purpose of verification that these two Gospels should be compared, and thirdly, that all this was anterior to the Gospel according to Luke. It might be inferred from the closing portion of the paragraph that Tertullian thought the Gospel of Luke itself stood in need of some verification. It does not follow, however, that the Gospel with which Paul was so anxious to compare his own was written before his. The word primitive, inserted by the ante-Nicene translator, usually ante in the Greek means another, a counterfeit, false, etc. in brackets before the word authors, we have therefore discarded as unnecessary to the sense and authorized. And as a footnote here, the language of Tertullian is Denic, ut cum octaribus contulit, etc., etc. Whatever that means in the Latin. It goes on about the opinion of Ewald that the Greek Gospel of Paul was the first ever written, possibly in the Greek. There is probably no great length of time intervening between the origin of that and of the other two Gospels of the first century. The testimony of Irenaeus, AD 190, concerning this Gospel is that it was written by Luke. Luke, also the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the Gospel preached by him. Notwithstanding the positive language he used, the statement is to be taken with some allowance. Irenaeus was fully committed to the four Gospels and was engaged in endeavouring to give them authority. He may be said in fact to have introduced them to the notice of the literary world, since he is the first author who mentions more than one of them. He speaks frequently of these Gospels and argues that they should be four in number, neither more or less, because there are four universal winds and 4 quarters of the world. It'd be north, east, west, south. We're pretty sure that's what he's talking about. Davidson calls him credulous and blundering. Those who are so quick to receive the statement of Irenaeus that the Gospel of Paul was written by Luke, a statement manifestly made to give apostolic sanction to the Gospel of Luke, are not prepared to accept so readily his assertion that the ministry of Jesus lasted 20 years and that he was 50 years old at his crucifixion. The Gospel or Recollections of Peter. This was a book more generally known than the Gospel of Paul, and the existence of which there can be no doubt. In the year 190, a large number of the Gospels of Peter were found in use by the Church of Rossus in Cilicia, and so much were the Christians of that church attached to them that it became necessary for Serapion, one of the bishops, to suppress them and to substitute the canonical Gospels in their stead. Footnote indication right there. Neither, okay, we get it at the bottom here. 1. Dr. Lardner's Works, Volume 4, page 686, Theodoret. And further on, Lost and Hostile Gospels by S. Baring Gold. Page 245. Theodoret there says the Nazarenes held that Christ was a just man, and they used the Gospel of Peter. He speaks as of his own day, AD 430. Eusebius had a peculiar faculty for diverging from the truth. So he was, this is indicating he was an exaggerator or false or even a liar. Let us see how far from it he has gone in these assertions. One Justin Martyr, in a dialogue written about AD 160, says, the mention of the fact that Christ changed the name of Peter, one of the apostles, and that the event has been recorded in Peter's memoirs, his Gospels, right, his writings, together with his having changed his name of two other brethren, who were sons of Zebedee, to Boanerges, tended to signify that he was the same through whom the surname Israel was given to Jacob, and Joshua to Hosea. Dialogue with Trypho, chapter 106. The translation is given in the Ante-Nicene Christian Library, volume 2, page 233, is as follows. And when it is said that he changed the name of one of his apostles to Peter, and when it is written in the memoirs of him that this so happened, as well as that he changed the names of other two brothers, and so forth. The word him, commencing with a capital letter, of course refers to Christ, thus making it read the memoirs of Christ and ignoring the Peter as the author. The Greek is, and has a Greek following here. Such a construction, besides referring the pronoun evro, is it? Whatever that says in Greek, of him, at the close of the sentence to the more distant antecedent, contrary to the rule in such cases, attributes to Justin language which he is not in the habit of using. Elsewhere, when speaking of the Gospels which he cites so frequently, he calls them not memoirs of Christ, but memoirs of the Apostles. He has 10 times memoirs of the Apostles and 5 times memoirs, not once memoirs of Christ. And for this rendering, the author has adopted, or these people have adopted, the authority of Dr. Westcott and Hort, right? Westcott and Hort fame, and other eminent scholars. Moreover, it is powerfully supported by the fact that the only one of the canonical Gospels which has the account of the change of the name of James and John to Boanerges is Mark, which has such an intimate connection with the Gospel of Peter. See Mark 3:17. These writers conclude, therefore, that Justin Martyr here refers to the memoirs or recollections of Peter, which can be nothing else than the Gospel of Peter. It was probably a consideration of this passage which induced Credner to say that Justin made use of the Gospel. And there's some references there probably. The next writer who refers to the Gospel of Peter is Tertullian, AD 207 to 210. He was one of the 3 fathers who were engaged in establishing the canonical Gospels. As Irenaeus had undertaken to confound the Gospel of Paul with the Gospel of Luke, so Tertullian endeavours to identify the Gospel of Peter with the Gospel of Mark. He says, the gospel which Mark published is affirmed to be Peter's, whose interpreter Mark was. Jones, who is unwilling to recognise the gospel of Peter as authoritative, attempts to break the force of this testimony by interpolating in the translation the words by some, thus is affirmed by some to be Peter's, but this is entirely unauthorised. The original is Evangelium quod editit Marcus, etc., etc., translated in the Ante-Nicene collection. That gospel which Mark published may be affirmed to be Peter's, whose interpreter Mark was. Tertullian manifestly intended to assert that in his day the gospel of Mark was understood to be Peter's, or to have the gospel of Peter for its original. 3. The third father who referred to this gospel was Origin, AD 230. There are some, says he, who say the brethren of Christ here mentioned were the children of Joseph by a former wife who lived with him before Mary, and they are induced to this opinion by some passages in that which is entitled the Gospel of Peter or the Book of James. Comparison on Matthew 13:55. It must not be inferred that Origen here speaks of the books as the same, but that the opinion was held in accordance with passages in the one book or the other. In the Proto-Evangelion, or Book of James, as it was called, it is related that when the high priest told Joseph that he was the person selected to take the virgin, he demurred, saying, I am an old man and have children, but she is young, and I fear lest I should appear ridiculous in Israel. So that would boost that claim that Joseph was an older man, maybe 44, 48. He wasn't actually a husband. He's just one, in that sense, person who took care of her, because she would be persecuted by the other Jews for being pregnant by the power of the Holy Spirit. Right? They're not saying that. They're saying, well, she's pregnant. Who she slept with? She's mucked around. She's an adulteress. She should be stoned. All this sort of stuff, right? So he takes her out of there, whisks her away, and then looks after her. Right? And some say, there's two Josephs mentioned in Matthew. One's supposed the husband to be. He may have died or something on the way. Or he's this older gentleman, possibly Joseph's father or something like that. They have all these different kind of theories. So you have to do your own personal research and figure that one out for yourself. Is it true or is it later baloney? Yeah, this guy being an older man, he's talked about for a while, etc., etc., but then he's not in the picture anymore. So he may have died, right? Though Origen was not fully prepared to accept the statement and not seeing it in the canonical Gospels, which had then, to use his own language, been chosen and were thenceforth to be authoritative, yet the fact that it had become so well understood from the previous use of the other Gospels that it was, for most of the fathers, implicitly received as true for a long time afterward. Epiphanius, Chrysostom, Cyril, Theophylactic. It sounds kind of weird. Is it Theophylactic? Oh yeah, not phylactic. Euchymenius and all the Latin fathers to Ambrose and the Greek fathers afterwards held to the opinion that Joseph was a widower and had children by a former wife, showing that the Gospel of Peter and the Proto-Evangelion were regarded as authority. Thus we find the Gospels of Peter expressly referred to by three of the fathers before Eusebius. This would be the church fathers of the Roman Catholic Church probably, though that historian asserts that no one of them had consented to make any mention of it. Eusebius exhibited a still more reckless disregard for the truth in regard to the preaching of Peter. He made a similar sweeping assertion respecting that, while the fact was it had been mentioned by Heracleon and Lactantius, and 6 times by Clement of Alexandria, and every time with indications of approval. It may be well to mention that error of some writers in supposing the preaching of Peter and the preaching of Paul to be one book, or parts of the same book, merely from their being mentioned in the same connection by Lactantius. Such an inference is not authorized. Some sort of indication down here, footnote indication, right? So there's a footnote here. 1, and that not 4 Gospels, but very many were written, out of which those we have chosen and delivered to the churches we may perceive, etc. Origen. Can we see it? Again, 4 Gospels only have been approved out of which the doctrines of our Lord and Saviour are to be learned. These Gospels were selected or separated from others. We've got page 317. Other writers have mentioned this Gospel. Theodoret, AD 430, says the Nazarenes are Jews who venerate Christ as a just man merely, and is said they use the Gospel according to Peter. Credner thinks the Gospel was one of the oldest writings of the Church and a source from which Justin Martyr drew many of his quotations. Also that it was essentially identical with the harmony of Tatian and the Gospel according to the Hebrews. And there's all this references here. Dr. Mill says it was publicly read by the Christians, and Mr. Fiston asserts that it was probably, in some sense, a sacred book. Jones, who wished to discredit it, says that it was interdicted by the decrees of Pope Gelasius, AD 49-4, according to some copies, though he does not explain how the interdict crept into these copies, nor why it is not in a decree as generally published, and as it appears in his own work, volume 1, page 154. The Gospel of Peter favoured the opinions of the Docetai, who held that Christ and Jesus were different, that Jesus really suffered, but Christ only in appearance. Norton, in his Evidences of the Genuineness of the Gospels, by Andrew Norton, Boston, 1887, volume 1, page 233, notes, is entitled to great weight. Thinks this Gospel was not a history of Christ's ministry. Reverend S. Baring Gold asks the question, was this Gospel a corrupted edition of St. Mark? And answers it thus, probably not. We have not much ground on which to base an opinion, but there is just sufficient to make it likely that such was not the case.